I'd like to welcome you to this webinar this fine afternoon. It's a beautiful late spring afternoon here in Atlanta. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm. We're pleased to have you joining us for this Crisis Coach webinar series. Today is the 6th in the RenWeb 2015 series, and we're talking about creating a culture of preparedness. Our presenter today is the president of Firestorm, Jim Satterfield. He will be with us in a few minutes. We'd like to invite you to become our friend. Firestorm Solutions is our Facebook. Firestorm Soul is Twitter. You can follow us on the hashtag for this session. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risks and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product provided must be read and considered in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, this information should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is delighted to have a partnership relationship with RenWeb. They're providing these Crisis Coach webinars presentations as part of their drive to assist schools in being prepared. As I mentioned, we're talking about creating a culture of preparedness. Jim, would you like to say some good things about the RenWeb people?
That's always easy to do. Shannon would be here. I don't know if she's gotten tied up helping another school as we come together. But RenWeb, obviously, in their commitments and the programs that they do to school make a great difference. I wanted to remind everybody, and I'm sure Shannon would if she was here, of the user conference next month in San Antonio. It's the second week in July, and it's a great opportunity to network with other schools and see what's going on. And if you've never attended one of those conferences, I think you and your team will find it very rewarding. We are going to be doing a Crisis Coach boot camp at the conference this year with a series of breakout sessions that you can go through, and it will take you through an entire program. One additional, if you're planning on being there, I would encourage you to bring your plan with you, and if you'll schedule with us, we'll do a one-on-one review with you about your plan and where it is relative to standards and best practices, and give you some tips and suggestions at that point. So if you'd like to participate in that, just let us know, and we'll get that coordination in place at the conference. My name is Jim Satterfield, and I'm glad to be with you today. I'm the president and one of the founders of Firestorm, and we're going to continue the Crisis Coach webinar series today, talking about what's involved in creating a culture of preparedness. And we're going to go into a couple of different areas today than what you have historically thought of as we think about the planning in our schools. What we find is, in many cases, a period of disaster denial. It's not that things are impossible, it's just that they're unthinkable. And schools and businesses really haven't addressed them, and it's part of a natural defense mechanism, as you see from the quote there. But we'll hear things like, it's not going to happen to here, or it won't be so bad, or we'll figure it out, we're smarter than everybody else. As those elements start to come together, it'll cost too much. You know what, we'll work on this next year, and next year comes and goes, and it's still not there. As we think about it, when we think about quality, and there's an ISO standard for quality, and we think about education, it's a continuous improvement process like quality, but now into the ISO standards, we've added the concept of risk. So risk and quality are linked together. And there are things that we can do with risk, and it's the same in our schools as it would be in our businesses. You can prevent risk, you can mitigate it, you can transfer it. Insurance is a mechanism that could use in some of those areas. And what we really want to do is to find a way to create a culture where we're focused on the identification of those risks and have a metric-driven decision process to be able to make the decisions in a very stressful environment as we think about the exposures that we find in our schools. As we continue on and looking at that, it's this culture, it's the attitudes, it's the beliefs. If I had opened up the mic to all the schools that were attending today, and I'd say, give me the mission statement for your school, you would be able to do that very quickly. It's on your website. It's around who you are. It's the timeless aspect of it. But that culture defines who you are. It defines the decision making, how your employees and your students are treated, and how information flows within there. And there are some unwritten rules within an organization that evolves a part of that culture. Well, the same thing starts to move forward within an organization. And if you forget the culture of the school, then you face exposures. A crisis might be occurring and it goes undetected. Sometimes there's a shoot the messenger who brings you the message that something is going wrong or not happening there. You probably have heard me talk about the fact that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5 and it was my birthday. If we're having a surprise at school, in many cases, it's certainly not a positive event as we go forward. And it puts us in a situation where we're reacting instead of having a pre-action, a plan, where everybody is on the same page. And if we're explaining, we're losing in those areas. We could have prevented that from happening. The bullying occurred, but we didn't know about it. If you then are telling no stories, it's not going to be helpful in the process. And in fact, you're going to underestimate the consequences of the event. Unfortunately, in the last couple of weeks, we've had to respond to some bullying episodes in schools, a termination of a teacher that had a negative outcome, some sexual molestation. In fact, 2 stories of those that have just come in, and we're working with schools and helping through those types of areas. So what we want to do is to go back to our culture and think about who we are. Now, one of our strategic partners is up in New York and Rochester, and he did a survey, and his name's Chip Dawson. You all would like to have Chip, and maybe I'll have him on one of our webinars together as we talk. But he wrote a paper called On Hiding Under the Desk and Other Disaster Strategies. And Chip has a sense of humor, as you can tell from the title of the article that's listed there. But he did a survey of businesses in upstate New York about calling 911. And I was startled at the result, and I think it has direct bearing on us in our schools and what we're doing. And of those businesses that were surveyed, 64% called 911 in the last year. Only 34% didn't. I would have guessed that it would have been in the low single digits, but imagine 64% of the businesses felt they had to call 911. 24% of those called once, 6% twice. Of the remaining, one organization called 75 times and another 25 times. And then he divided into why were they calling 911? Medical issues, crime, violence, fires, hazardous materials, as we would go forward. Now, there was the good news. 85% of those companies had a plan. Some had not done drills and exercise. Some had only done the basics, kind of like a fire drill that sometimes happens to us in schools, that's all that we do. Only half had done a threat assessment. And I would wonder if we were surveying everybody on all the schools that are on the call today about, have you done a threat assessment within your school, what that percentage would match it up. But if you look at the last one, only 35% of those businesses did a business impact analysis to analyze what would happen in their business if something happened to one of their departments, one of their areas within the company. 65% were not aware of what the impacts would be, and that's part of going to create a culture and why we get this disaster denial that we see many times, and it's hard to maybe get the budget support from your board or to get the buy-in from everybody on your team and trying to work it together. And we find a lot of questions get asked, and when we think about creating this culture of preparedness, you get asked questions like, are you ready, and how do you know, and are you sure? And one of the differentials here are to get people to move away from just what to understanding the how and the why. And if you understand the impacts on the school, that might well help people to better understand the things that you're asking them to do and to carry it forward. As we look at our plans, we're always focused on making sure that schools not only know what to do, but how to do it. And importantly, everybody needs to understand the why we're carrying forward. Now, when is it okay to accept a risk and when is it not? Obviously, if it's something that could lead to the death of a child, that's an unacceptable risk for us to have. And that gets us into some of the intelligence monitoring that we've talked about and the other impacts that are there. Because if you could know, wouldn't you want to know what's going on? And so what is it that you're willing to risk, and how do we get buy-in? And I'm going to take you through a process, and I want you to think about your school as a business. You're in the business of education. You're in the business of providing care, custody, and control of the children that that are in your school every day. And those are the elements that we want to focus. And if you understood, if everyone within the school, and the teachers and the leadership and the department heads and the coaches and everyone else understand the impacts on the school, I think you would find it would be easier for you to develop the plans that you're looking for, whether it's a plan around bullying or workplace violence or behavioral threat risk assessments or communicable illness or emergency response. Those types of things all come from people understanding what are the impacts on us if we don't have them in place. Now, as we move from this what and when to how and why, we emphasize the fact that every crisis is a human crisis. If we don't have people, we're not going to have recovery. If your teachers aren't there, you're not going to be able to run your classes. You're not going to be able to carry out the mission that you've been established. And so this isn't about alarm systems and bells and just locked doors. Those things all help. It's about understanding our people, our processes, and our procedures. And as I shared earlier, it's a continuous improvement process. And one of the things that I would encourage you to do is to align your plans to standards and best practices. And it's very clear to do. We've done some webinars around benchmarking. And by the way, if you want to see where your plans are, again, that conference in July in San Antonio might be an opportunity for you to think about it. So why do we do a business impact analysis? And what is it that we're trying to do here? We're trying to determine which risks are acceptable to us and which risks aren't. Now, it's obvious that we want to address certain risks. They're so great that we have to. While the probability that we're going to have an armed intruder in our school is extremely low, we need to be prepared for those events. That's why we go into lockout, lockdown, why we want to do drills and exercises around those events, and even doing an armed intruder where there's students out on the sports field or the athletic field. We've got to consider also maintaining the knowledge that we have. As we change and as new contracts are coming out for the fall and teachers are getting those, and you look at your faculty and staff and how different will it be when school restarts in the fall than it is here, there's information that people have, and as we move through, some of that knowledge is lost. And that's one of the things that you want to think about, and it's part of the reason that we focus on looking at what the impacts are to better understand how we document, how we prevent those elements. It's a way to create this culture and get buy-in. And going to those individuals that are already there, capturing that knowledge and integrating it within our plan. So this business impact analysis becomes the foundation of all of our plans. It's to identify the critical areas that must recover if we're going to have a return to normal operations and do so as quickly. Our schools are a business. We teach students. They pay us tuition. That's how we maintain the vibrancy of our business. But what would happen if some of our functionality wasn't there? Well, if we weren't able to open the office, we could still teach in the classrooms, or maybe we have to shift to another area. So it's important that you start to document the business processes within your school so that if there was a problem that occurred, you'd be able to deal directly, and those impacts drive the decisions that we make within our organization. Now, in a business impact analysis, we look at the process, at the in, out, and across process. We look at everything that comes into our school and everything that goes out. That could be the cleaning crew, the people that are providing the meals in the cafeteria. It could be the supplies. It could be the parents dropping students off or other individuals coming in and out. So defining what all those processes are and everything that moves in and out becomes a critical element for us in looking at this business impact. We'd see how they would be impacted in the event of a disaster or a crisis, and then how do we mitigate those impacts, and how do we optimize recovery. And we view it from a strategic, financial, operational, and external perspective. Sometimes this is more complicated, sometimes it's easy. Being able to lock our classrooms from the inside is a way to show that we'd have operational control of who can get in and out of a classroom, and a standard and best practice is that those classrooms should be locked during a class to provide that extra element of protection. But if we think about our business and departments, what else do we need to do? Could you operate without a particular function? Would you operate your school today if the school nurse wasn't there? Yeah, probably. We'd have to do some workaround, and by the way, as we saw in all those 911 calls earlier, that was a vast percentage of the phone calls from the businesses were calling and trying to get medical help associated with it. But how would it impact our school if that department or that function wasn't there? How will we operate our school and carry it forward? What keeps the school running? What can wait till later? We focus a lot on the threat and the risk issues as we've talked about. Today we're going to focus on the business issues within our school and how we need to keep that functioning and going forward. Because if we're not maintaining the finances within our school, if we're not able to generate those things, it will make a difference in our survivability. We worked with a school last year where the parents had paid the tuition for the period of time, and it was to go into an escrow fund, and that fund got spent. As a result, they didn't have the funds available to pay the teachers over the summer break, and as you can imagine, the implications of that were quite severe. So designing these issues early, putting them in place, will make a difference in that process. So how do we do it? Well, we start out with a document review, and you can do that yourself. Look at your plans. Look at what they address. Do they address the business side of your school, or do they only address emergency, the evacuation, the shelter in place, the lockout and lockdown? After you've done a review, you design a questionnaire, and we'll show you what some of those would look like to talk about what they need in order to run their department or function within the school. You do an analysis of that and sit down and do an interview with the people who filled out the questionnaires. And generally we're looking at the department heads in each of your areas, creating a draft report and then coming back with a conversation and then a final. So to go through this process for school, you could probably do this easily in a month. With sending out the questionnaires, they take about 30 minutes. The interviews, probably about the same period of time. Putting together a report and understanding, coming together at that point. Now, in a business, we look at these types of departments, but I tried to list some that would apply in a school environment. Some of you are independent schools, and you've got dorms, so there's residency issues in areas that you're carrying forward in student life. You may have an athletics function and have to support that, and how do we perform in those areas? Library, financial aid. You've got facilities and grounds. Purchasing, legal, student services, counseling, a lot of various departments. So you would define what are the departments that are appropriate in our school as we think about them, and what would it take to have those departments functioning, and which ones could we do without, and which ones must we have. And if we're going to miss one, what's the order in which I restore those functions within our organization? That's what we talk about in terms of understanding a business impact analysis on our school if something catastrophic were in fact to occur. So as we think about it, we think about each one of the functions that we just listed. We're going to be focusing on what's the criticality of it, the urgency, how critical is it? They're all important or you wouldn't have them, but how critical? The interdependencies, my department depends upon your department for these functions. Externally, who are our critical vendors and our suppliers? What do they provide us with? Are there alternatives for us to look at and to see and do? What's the applications that we must use to run our school? Do we have something that helps us with our curriculum and our programs, or our attendance, or our financial aid? Do we have a central repository that would help us track behaviors of concern and to carry that forward and to know what the plans are associated for each of those students? What are the vital records? We're in a scenario now and working with the breaches that have occurred out within schools, where their data is, you've got financial aid and you've got financial information. How secure is that? What would happen if something led to a breach associated with it and that information was lost? What would you do? What should you tell parents? What if information was released inappropriately that shared information about medical or even other personal issues that were associated with it? So what we would then want to focus on is, what are the impacts if we can't perform those services in those individual departments? How will we go about putting them back together? What are the recovery time objectives? How quickly? We can't necessarily have everything back up and running the same day. Something's got to happen first, then second, then third, the recovery point. And then what are the resources to pull all of those areas together and make them happen? So what's critical? Well, we want to base it on the importance of the operation and the time sensitivity of it. How quickly do we have to have this back? How quickly does it have to operate? Now, those things that are life safety and environmental, those go probably fairly critically, very quickly. If we had a department that was helping students with planning where they wanted to go to college next year, if there was a crisis or emergency, deferring that for a week or two wouldn't necessarily have a big impact on us. Where other things would certainly have an impact, where we had an armed intruder threat, those we can't defer. We need to deal with those right now. Anything that's a student support related service, if we've got dorms, if we've got food, if we've got other elements that we're putting in place, that those services in fact must be there. And anything that's revenue generating. If we're not running classes, if we're not providing the education that's there, that's going to jeopardize our revenue associated with the school. And remember the example that I gave you earlier about the school that spent the money that they had in escrow for classes later in the year, and that was a financial problem that was generated within that period of time. So the priorities. Look at each function in exactly the same light. How long can the school perform this function, not perform this function without having significant financial losses, student or parent unhappiness? I know that we all don't want to have lots of parents calling the office complaining about what's going on and the problems associated there. Fines or penalties from regulators. We helped a school in Texas just recently where there were some allegations made against the school, and you had family services in, you had the certification authorities into the school, you also had the police doing an investigation all around what the parents had alleged occurred or did not occur, and so those fines and penalties, and finally lawsuits associated with what could arrange. So if you don't have that, and this department would do that, that's the area where it would become important. So we started talking about reviewing your plans, putting those elements in place, and if you were looking at this beyond it, you would then send a questionnaire out. And a questionnaire, and here's a sample, and I understand it's small and hard to read, and if you need some help later on sharing that, let us know. But you go to each one of your department heads, they'd say how many employees do they have, or if they've got some contractors or part-time, sometimes we have teacher aides involved, and what are you doing in that department? What are the key processes that you need to have included within it? And then we give a scenario to think about, and then think about what the recovery time objective would be. Is that something that you could defer that for 2 weeks? You know, we might defer those field trips for a while, or some of the other programs that we're considering. How hard is it to recover? What's our data loss tolerance associated with it? Those elements are coming in, again, in supporting our school. As we think about that, then you start to ask, well, what are the impacts that we would have? And the impacts fall in one of two areas, operational or financial. Are there contracts and agreements that we'd have in place? And those would create a particular problem if we didn't have the support here. If you don't have the people that are doing the cleaning on the building every day, or the people that are helping you prepare food, or if you've got coaches that are coming in to work in the soccer program or something else within your school. Are there regulatory compliance issues that would become a problem if you're not able to get the documentation that you need to have or file the necessary reports in an area? Reputation and image. Dealing with a school, you don't want to be known as the school that was responsible for the bullying, the impacts that could associate with that. The quality of service to the students, to the families. They really are your clients here. And any negative impact on the employees. Those all are operational impacts. And so if the department or function wasn't there for a day, or 2 or 3, or 4 to 5, now you start to see how it builds. And you'd rate that from no impact to severe for each department. And this gives us the ability to start to rank the departments from relative criticality. The financial impacts, are there penalties? Are there one-time expenses? Is there some backlog processing that we would encourage in order to get that function dealt with and done? So the recovery time objectives are driven by the consequences of not performing it. If there are no consequences, we can operate without that function or department for a long period of time. Those are the ones that we're going to then help to develop that priority, to check their tolerance for outage. Now, when we look at all the functions that we have, they will become ranked based upon their criticality. As the criticality increases, it has a higher recovery time priority and a shorter recovery time objective. So think about it. If it's absolutely critical that you're going to have that, you're going to try to make that happen sooner instead of later, and we need to make sure that that function happens before we do any other. So what we're trying to do is to take a concept of getting our school back up and running. If we've had a catastrophic event, if we've had something significant that's occurred, how do we start to pull this together and turn our business back around? And how much data loss can we have? How much information? And that would be putting things into the computer and updating it. The attendance reports. We went into a school and helped them with their plans, and as we were working on it, and they did the attendance in the morning in the homeroom, but before that information got entered into the computer, it was late afternoon. Well, think about that. You could have children who the parents thought were at school, and in fact, before the call was made home to have that validated of why wasn't Mary in school today, that time lapse could present a risk or a threat. Maybe something happened to Mary. And those are the elements that we think about in terms of the data loss and access to the information that's available to us. So when you look at this chart, the recovery time objective and the recovery point, the shorter that cycle is, the more money it's going to cost. You don't have all of your internal systems outside of the RenWeb backed up someplace else. But if you lost your servers at the school, your access to the internet, it could potentially be an impact upon your business and your operation. So understanding what those things are, what are the other materials that you need, become very critical. And that leads us into the dependency conversation. My department depends upon that department for a particular purpose. Have you outlined and identified what each one of your departments needs from the other departments within your school? Externally, who are the companies or the vendors that you rely on? What do you rely on them for? Or what's the alternative source of finding that information? If there isn't, and your sole source and they're the only people that can do that, if something were to happen to them, that becomes absolutely critical to you and your school and would disrupt. Now, fortunately with RenWeb, you've got backup of information in the cloud, and their support systems are there, but are there other systems and applications that you use within your school? Are they mission critical? Are they non-essential? Are they deferrable? Understanding those become very important as you look at those individual applications. And then any regulatory reporting, who do you report to? What's the name of the report? Who is the agency that you have to give it to? What's the frequency of those reports that have to be filed? And then find the type of penalty. Now, we know that every one of our schools has an accounting department. We know that you have payroll, and you have certain reporting requirements specifically there. And we all know that we have the responsibility, because we have care, custody, and control over our young people. If we feel that a child is in danger or in jeopardy, we have a mandatory reporting requirement that we share that with the appropriate authorities in a timely manner. Those are the issues that are before us, and documenting those and having a central location where they are would certainly help us. What are the vital records? Where do we need those? Databases, contact lists, reference documents, drawings and diagrams of our school. How is it built versus in reality versus the way that it was initially designed? Many of us have inherited schools that are within churches, and the layout and the flow of people in the church area, in the diagrams, contracts, the teachers' contracts with you, the employees, the contracts with your vendors. Where is that information? What would happen to you if you didn't have it? How do you maintain it? Where is it controlled? Is there any particular special equipment? When you look at the paper stock there, we find that many people have payroll services, and they do it electronically, and they do an excellent job. But the ability to pay bills if something were to happen to your computer systems and you had to write a manual check, will you keep manual checks at home with your controller or office manager or your head of school, so that if they had to issue a check in with the computer systems unavailable for whatever reason, now you have an opportunity to be able to fulfill and back that up. So after you've answered all those questions and done, then you'd be able to create a relative criticality of your departments. Now, this is not a school that I've shown here, as you can look and see those departments, but there's no question that when you look at that, you can see that in this particular company, their retail property management and security was their highest priority. They had to get that up before anything else, but their corporate affairs and leasing, not so important. They could defer those activities. The same thing will be true in your school as you understand each of those elements. Now, the questionnaire that we showed you earlier gives you a chance to capture that information as it's coming in. And if you look, and when the questionnaires were filled out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 departments felt like they had to be up in one day. They had to go to the head of the list to be the first. But in the interviews, when you start asking questions about it, you found that there were only 4 departments that had to be up in this particular organization. Because what they really felt, and once we started pressing, you find out, no, you could really defer that. You know, we're not going to be going out to recruit new teachers at this point in time. We're going to be doing something else. It's a deferrable action that would come together. So this company, you had a fairly radical change from the way the questionnaire was filled out to where the interview took it. By the way, a tip is that everybody thinks they're the most important department in your school, unless you're completely different from the others that we've seen and work together. So the metrics then come in, and you see the financial impact scores and the operational scores, and again, this is for a different company, not a school, looking and seeing the order. But as you focus on that, you could immediately see in this scenario that if you look over here that corporate affairs scored a 2 and engineering scored a 91, well, that would tell me I better bring the engineering up before I bring up corporate affairs within that organization. What are your departments? What's their relative criticality based upon just financial and operational impacts within your school? The recovery priorities then are seen here based upon that total criticality. There's an order in which you recover them in. There's the recovery time. There's the how quick current does our data and information have to be? How difficult is it to restore them? And how long does it take to get everything back up? Fortunately, in the school environment, if we have access to the internet and our RenWeb information, and if we have access to a classroom, we can probably restart a lot of our activities fairly quickly. So the complexity of this won't be as great as we would find in a traditional business environment. But you take the departments then based upon that, and we create a Tier 1 and a Tier 2 recovery. For example, we're not telling human resources in this company they're not important, but we better, for that company, get up their engineering, security, and other departments first, and then we will get the others up. By the way, many times when you recover the Tier 1 department, automatically the Tier 2 departments start to recover. Now you'll see here some analysis of this thing coming together, and the reason to share all of this level of detail with you is this goes back to creating that culture of preparedness. Because when you talk about and you go in and you meet with the board and the other members within the school, and they want to know, well, why are we spending time on this? Why are we doing it? And you can come back and say, look, this shows you the impact that we have and why it needs to be done and how we're going to go about organizing these elements within it. In that first little diagram up on the left, you'd see that regulatory impact for that organization was minimal, but their quality of service became a key driver with it. You look at the cumulative effects of the impacts over time, and you can see it was getting much worse. And think about that. That's exactly true in our schools. If you had to close for a day, a snow day, or whatever day it would be, a broken water pipe that would make the school not accessible, not going to have a tremendous impact. But if that school is going to be down for 2 weeks, that's a major problem. Now, fortunately, in the environment we're in now, you could give out assignments. You could have the students working from home for a period of time to maintain that operation, but that needs to be defined in advance. That's part of your crisis response or your business response there. How do we work? How do we give school when it's going to be school at home, not school at school? Think about those procedures, run a test, and validate that that will work for you in the environment. Take a few days at a point in time during the school year and say, tomorrow we're going to test and what it's going to be like if the 4th grade has to work from home, or the 9th grade, or the 10th, or the 11th. And then test it so that everyone knows how it works and the access. Then you can test having more than one group out because there may be a capacity issue for access and involvement. Then you look at the cumulative departmental impacts, and the chart down in the bottom right splits those out so that you can start to see who's causing most of this impact, and then what are the penalties, one-time expenses, and the processing that we're going to have to go through. Again, they're assuming operations. Some take longer, some take less. In this example, most of that company could be back up and running in 4 hours if they had access to IT, but wait a minute, the information technology in that company couldn't be back up for more than a day. So those other departments aren't going to be restored unless they have manual workarounds associated with it. Dependencies become very straightforward and a key planning tool for you. You'll look at the list here. It shows you we'll pick one of the lists there. Look at the accounting. It says they depend upon management for approval of invoices. Well, that probably is true in the school. Somebody has to sign off on the invoices within your school to say it's okay to cut a check and make a payment. So if you go through all of your departments, they list who internally they depend on and what they depend on them for. As you move over externally, you go again on a department-by-department basis. Who do they depend upon? Who's the outside supplier? What's the product or service that they deliver? And is it sole source? If they don't have an alternate source, they're more critical. So as you look there in all those no's in that last column, those are people that have the potential to stop the particular business that we're looking at here. Is there a supplier that one of your departments has that would cause that to be unable to function? That is an element for us to think about as we develop our plans. And then our applications and what are we depending on. And RenWeb is great because it's internet-based and it's available as soon as we can restore internet access and we carry it forward. But there may be other programs and applications that are a part of your school. What are they and how do they interface? And then finally, is there any special equipment that's needed? Those are the resources that we want to make sure that those supplies are available. Have you thought about the emergency supplies if you had to shelter in place for an extended period? We in Atlanta regularly don't have snow and ice, but at least once or twice in a season we'll have an ice storm. And ice storms here are very bad. They coat the trees, and the tree limbs break and take out the power lines. The roads get closed. And 2 years ago, we had 10,000 students in one of our counties trapped at school, and they had to spend the night there. Well, do you have plans for that? Do you have procedures? Have you put those elements in place? Well, that's where those special needs in equipment and applications come together. Now, we follow a predict, plan, perform process. We've given you some different information today to think about. It hasn't been talking about violence and armed intruders and those specifics. It's been talking about the business of our school, running the business of our school. What do we need to have into place? Well, you've got to understand what the vulnerabilities and threats are. Now, I encourage you to work with the local police and the local fire department. So the fire marshal can come in and identify fire risk and exposures for you. The police are very good at looking at some of the physical security aspects of your campus and layout. But you also need to look at the business risks that are built within your organization. What do you need to have in place to deal with those business risks or loss of facility, loss of workforce that are going to have a direct impact? Understanding the risk and then the impact of that risk, and then how do we monitor and what are the triggers? How do we know if that's about to happen? How do we know it as quickly as it's done? That's the intelligence networks that we've seen talked about in some of our previous webinars, because we're finding now that things that are starting to emerge as threats or risks to our school are being discussed right now on the internet, and if you're not looking for it, you won't know about it. All of the plans that we've talked about, be they emergency plans, crisis management, workplace violence, behaviors of concern, communicable illness, all of those plans are integrated together, and then finally the perform, the training, the exercises, the monitoring, and the testing of them. So would you want to know what will happen tomorrow? Would you like to know if at your school there was some kind of a significant disruption and you lost some departments, what the impacts would be? It would tell you, hey, we better work on doing that documentation. We better have a backup associated with that particular area. Or if that person is not available or the second person isn't available, how will we handle that? Sandy Hook, which we did the webinar last month and shared with some of the impacts associated with it. Oh, by the way, Michael is going to do a follow-up to answer the questions from that webinar today at 4 o'clock Eastern, 3 o'clock Central. If you want to join that, you can sign up from our website. But to go through and look at those impacts. But when the shooter came in, he killed the principal, he killed the school psychologist, and he seriously wounded the associate principal. So the leadership of the school was gone. What do? How do they communicate? When they evacuated, all of their records of who was at school that day, they were not outside. They didn't have access to that information. How would you do it at your school? How would you make your reunification plan work in those areas? Can you afford not to know about those areas? If you want to see how your team would respond in these, I would tell you that we're doing a virtual exercise in August. We're going to do one for schools and one for businesses. You could get your team, your emergency team or your crisis team around a table at the school and go through that exercise and see how your school performs relative to all other schools across the country. That's in August. That information is on our website. You can also come to the RenWeb user conference next month and see and participate in things in that area. We can work with you to help make sure that your plans align to standards of best practices. You can create your own intelligence network. You can find out where your plans are relative to standards and best practices. The cost of that assessment is being covered by RenWeb, and it's a $2,500 value. So our thanks to RenWeb, and Shannon, I think you probably joined us a little late there because I see that you come in, but I don't think you're on our phone line at the moment. But I encourage you to listen and watch the information that comes from RenWeb. It's a chance for you and your team at your school to grow, and the user conference in particular is a big advantage. If you've got questions about what we covered today, you can go to firestorm.com, or you can fill out a contact form, and we'll be back in touch with you. Or you can contact us at webinars@firestorm.com. Send us an email there, or give us a call at 800-321-2219. Thank you for being with us today, and the 6th in the webinar series. There'll be another next month, and I'll get the chance to see many of you face-to-face at the user group meeting in San Antonio. Bring your plans. We'll be glad to take a look and see how we can help. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for all that you do in your schools, and thanks again to RenWeb for underwriting the cost of this Crisis Coach webinar series. Thanks, everyone. Have a great summer. Bye.